Welcome to Practice Disrupted, a podcast where we find ways to create new solutions to current challenges while elevating the value of architects. I'm your host, Evelyn Lee, an architect who spans tech as an angel investor, startup advisor, and founder of Practice of Architecture. Whether you're a seasoned architect or just starting in the field, this podcast is your gateway to think differently about the role architects play within our global community. Hello, Disruptors. Welcome back to another episode of Practice Disrupted. Hold on to your seats because we will be covering a lot of ground with this week's guest, Eric Cesal. Eric and I first met back in what we think was around 2012 at the AIA Annual Leadership Summit, which was previously called Grassroots. He was actually the keynote there following the publication of his book, Down Detour Road, An Architect in Search of Practice. Throughout the years, while our paths never directly cross again, I followed his career from afar. And now that we're relatively geographically close to one another and have met a few times for coffee, I feel like we've become fast architecture friends with similar views and questions about the future of practice. So a little more about Eric. Eric is a designer, educator, writer, and a noted post-disaster expert, having led on-the-ground reconstruction programs after the Haiti earthquake, the Great East Japan tsunami, and Superstorm Sandy. He was formally trained as an architect, but his work has branched into international development, economics, and foreign policy as they affect the built environment. He holds advanced degrees in architecture and construction management and an MBA from Washington University in St. Louis. But he says his passion is understanding how design practice must evolve for the future amid trends in technological innovation, climate change, and urbanization. So yes, we are going to be getting into AI in this episode. So welcome to the show, Eric. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we usually start off with a little bit of an icebreaker. Your formal bio will, of course, and your link to your book will be in the show notes. But is there a little something that you'd like to share with our audience that people might not know about you?
Yeah, I think the thing that surprises people the most is that I'm an optimist. I speak a lot and teach a lot on disaster and rather gloomy things. But my personal worldview is that those things are the entry point to bigger and better things, and that by properly understanding crisis, we can move forward with changes that would otherwise be unmanageable.
Where does that optimism come from?
I think you have to have it when you work in disaster. There's a lot of truth in that past statement, but there's also a lot of evidence in the recovery of disaster. I've worked many disasters in my life and studied many more than that. And it's amazing to find consistently across all continents and cultures and time periods that, people are at their best when things get to be their worst. So I think that makes one sanguine about any future challenges in humanity because, sometimes things have to get really bad before they get good. But so far, the human species is batting 1,000 and we always figure things out. And, the last 10,000 years have been a slow march towards progress, no matter how acute and devastating disasters are in the midterm.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that are seeing what's happening in the world right now. And I would say, I believe a lot of our listeners are seeing what's happening in the world right now and see the need for more of this type of expertise with those in a background in architecture. So I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about your journey to becoming an expert in post-disaster experience and how you got there.
Yeah, sure. In the moment, it was quite serendipitous, but I think in hindsight, it seems like I might have had some kind of plan, although I don't know. My first 5 years were in commercial architecture. I worked at a couple of firms in DC and led a very kind of normal architectural life, and then went to graduate school in 2004 to get my MBA and my MArch. And Katrina happened right while I was in the middle of that. And I felt compelled to go. I don't think that was that weird. Over 1 million Americans volunteered in the Katrina recovery. So, at that point, I had enough maturity as an architect and had also worked in construction management and grew up on carpentry. So I felt like I had some skills that might be useful. And I managed to land at the Gulf Coast Community Design Studio under the leadership of David Perks. And, that was really a transformative experience for me. I mean, I think that disaster really convinces you about the value of design and the value of architecture. Once you see how the built environment has been stripped away and everything that is lost in that process and the trauma that is engendered, you start to get, I've always felt like you get an appreciation for the built environment that's not otherwise possible. So, at the same time, I mean, it's definitely hard, but, it built up my love for design and for architecture, being able to help people in that way. So in terms of, what people can do, I think, it's an individual decision, but, part of it is just doing it. I mean, you take a bit of a gamble and getting involved in that sort of thing, but I would ask architects to be confident that their skills have merit and value in those sorts of situations. Subsequently, I was in the lower Ninth Ward with Architecture for Humanity. I was going back and forth, so I was completing all of my degrees. I added a master's in construction management afterwards, and so I would spend summers down on the Katrina recovery and then the academic year in St. Louis completing my degrees. And then graduated in December of 2008, right into the recession, which is when I wrote down Detour Road. And then in January of 2010 was recruited by Architecture for Humanity to lead their Haiti mission, which was an education unto itself. So, it kind of snowballed from there. I think the critical first step is just deciding to get involved. I advise architects to do so with some sort of judgment and to ask themselves, like, are my skills necessary in this place, in this time? And more importantly, to ask others. I never went anywhere that I wasn't invited. And whenever I sat down with community members of organizations and that sort of thing, like, that was always my first question. I never made the presumption that I was necessary somehow. I mean, you got to wait for other people to surface that request.
I had another question and then you landed at that sentence and I was like, well, but then how do you get proactive about getting other people to surface that request? I guess I wanted to back up a little bit because you went back to get your master's, but you also decided to pair it with an MBA and construction administration degrees. And I don't think inherently a lot of architects do that because one, try to take on a multiple degree program with the rigor of architecture studio, but even consider like, oh, I should be getting an MBA on top of this. So what provoked you to pursue all of those things at once?
Yeah, well, masochism, probably. No, I think I had an experience in my younger years that most architects would find familiar. I mean, I was part of teams with older, more senior, more experienced architects, and we would work to design a project over 4 months, 6 months, 9 months, and then go into some kind of pre-construction meeting, and there was always some guy there with a spreadsheet, doing last minute editing on the design and saying, okay, we're striking this, we're not going to do that, da, 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 da. And I knew I didn't know what I was doing, but, I thought that my superiors knew what they were doing. I mean, these are very competent, talented senior architects. And I don't know, it alarmed me that someone with no experience in design was actually like designing the building effectively. And what does it say about what we do when, a designer's judgment is so easily and casually countermanded? So I went to business school principally because I wanted to learn how to speak that language. And I wanted to be able to defend design in the language of business and the language of finance. I never had any aspirations to go into business, whatever that is. But it seemed to me that if those kinds of people, had some kind of authority over the built environment that was going to supersede those of architects, then that's a language that I wanted to know so that I could be more convincing and more effective in my work. I mean, you can argue for design in design terms, and I think all architects learn how to do that. But I wanted to learn how to argue for design also in financial terms and in business terms. And the construction management degree was a similar logic. I mean, a lot happens to a design after construction starts. I mean, it's very common and very easy for contractors to, say, okay, well, we're not doing this, we're not doing that, and, get the ear of the owner and, radically change whatever the design was. So, yeah, I mean, I think both of those degrees were really about a more comprehensive idea of design. I mean, the core of design being architecture kind of right in the middle, the MBA being the stuff that was happening before the design, and the construction management being the stuff that was happening after.
Yeah. Okay, now back to my second question, and kind of architects playing this role where we're not necessarily stepping in as a know-it-all, but we do want to be working in partnership with communities in a way that they understand our value and kind of are surfacing the question to us to help us step in to some of those conversations. How do we do that?
Yeah, I think you just ask people, and I realize that's an unsatisfying answer. But no, quite seriously. I mean, you have to sit down with people and genuinely, ask questions about what their needs are. I mean, something I always tell people, when they're contemplating kind of getting into that line of work is you have to decide what you want to be more, a helper or an architect, because there are going to be times when those come into conflict. Not always, but sometimes. And if you have that straight in your head, then I think you can ask questions rather honestly. And if someone says like, hey, look, what I really need right now is, I don't know, some cash assistance or, some legal advocacy help or something, you say, okay, great. Let me see if I can connect you with some of my colleagues who do that sort of thing. I think there's a lot of post-disaster architecture that's done badly, and it's principally done because architects will go in and the architect wants to be an architect, so the solution has to be a building regardless of whatever the problem is. So all of my programs really involved a lot of diagnostics. I mean, sometimes months and months of getting to know a community, of building trust, of really understanding at a deeper level what the needs are and how you can help alleviate suffering. And eventually you usually get around to the idea that there's some sort of building, some sort of architectural expression that can really help people recover from disaster or otherwise help them in their situations. But I think that you need to be sober about the fact that the two can diverge. The answer is not always a design. It's not always a building. So I think that, yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's still one of the hardest things to teach in my classes is, go out and talk to people and like ask them. I mean, designers love designing, right? So it's like you want to sit down and you want to start, designing the solution to everybody's problems and things like that. But the critical first step is really just talking, asking questions, building trust, building relationships. I think that's how you properly frame whatever the problem is and therefore arrive at the right solution.
Fair. For those who are frequent listeners, I continue to make the argument that we will actually design more of the buildings that we want to design if we expand our conversation beyond buildings, right? Ultimately.
Yeah.
So in preparation of this episode, I went and pulled down your book, which I purchased way back then in Grassroots, and I need to get it signed, one. But I also began to flip through it and looked at my notes and remember kind of fondly the narrative that you were telling back then. I was really beginning to remember what was so enjoyable about your book. And I want you to humor me for a moment because I found a review from Michael Crosby, who is a professor of architecture at the University of Hartford, but also known for being a frequent contributor to Architecture Record. And he writes, "This book is highly unusual for an architecture opus. It is well written, it is funny, and it is wise in so many ways. I literally couldn't put it down." He ended up reading it in one sitting. Cesal finds useful parables for architects and their predicament in the most unusual places. The relationship of bartenders to bar owners, how prostitutes are and are not like architects, and how a good architect is like a fire extinguisher. Cesal offers a unique, refreshing take on the profession. So my question for you is, This book was now written over a decade ago at a time where we were obviously coming out of the Great Recession. Has the profession moved the needle, or are your analogies as true today as they were over a decade ago?
I think some yes, some no. I mean, I think the profession has made a lot of strides, a lot of progress. I think it's made a lot of progress in diversification, which is good. I think it's made a lot of progress in my field of disaster and resilience. And you look at some of the things that Ilya Azaroff are doing, and architecture has really started to take that stuff seriously. So I think those are all good things and represent forward motion. I think, unfortunately, it continues to struggle with the value question, which was one of the central themes of Down Detour Road. For those who haven't read it, I mean, part of the hypothesis was that, architects have a difficult time articulating what the value of architecture actually is. And that's why, in something like the recession in 2008, I mean, it was horrible for everybody, but it was an absolute disaster for architects because, largely speaking, like, people don't really understand the value of architecture or having an architect involved in, this problem or that problem.
I was going to say, well, it is definitely hard to understand that if all we're doing is showing them pretty pictures of our award-winning designs, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always tell people, and I think I wrote it into the book, people stopped caring about architecture because architecture stopped caring about people. We spent the 80s and the 90s designing big, shiny things for rich people. And then, lo and behold, society at large doesn't really see what architecture has to do with me, and who can blame them. And just to be clear, I put the blame squarely on us. I think that's a failure of our professional mission. And I don't find fault with the people that don't understand the value of architecture. I think we've failed to show them.
So being an optimist and looking at the current landscape of architecture and how technology is moving, where does the opportunity lie, and what do architects really need to focus on going forward?
Let's address the technology portion first. I mean, I think that, generative AI presents a legitimate potential disaster within the profession of architecture. And, by way of background, like in disaster studies, the sort of things that I teach is that disaster occurs at the intersection of a vulnerability and some sort of triggering event, right? So if you have a shaky foundation and there's an earthquake, like, your house is going to collapse. That seems intuitive. If you have a solid foundation and your house is seismically designed and there's an earthquake, probably no collapse. I mean, obviously it depends on a lot of factors, but that's the general idea. So it really takes the marriage of two things: some underlying vulnerability and some sort of event, some sort of shock to the system, to actually create a disaster. Earthquakes, hurricanes, fires, those aren't actually disasters. They're just events. Like, it takes our participation to make them into disasters, or lack of participation, really. So, I think you could read the Great Recession in that light, right? So when other professions were dealing with 5% unemployment, 6% unemployment, I think we lost like a third of all architects in the United States. I mean, that qualifies as a disaster. And I think the underlying vulnerability in that case is the value proposition, the value question. So as technology advances, my concern for the last year, and a lot of the advocacy work that I've been doing the last year, is that this is another one of those triggering events that is going to expose the underlying vulnerability that is our difficult value proposition and our inaction on resolving that particular thing since the Great Recession. In terms of what the opportunities are, they're massive. They're amazing, because I think fundamentally, AI, automation, generative AI, the whole ball of wax is going to speed things up quite a bit. It is going to displace a lot of architectural labor, and I think that we are going to face the question about what to do instead, like what to do next. For the last 10,000 years, it's always been the case that technological disruption comes, we run out of things to do, and then we find newer, better things to do. So one of the questions that I've been trying to raise is, what's next? I think that runs in parallel with the climate crisis, which is, equally bad, but perhaps less immediate than this AI thing. But, half of the world's cities are going to be like underwater by 2100. I mean, we're going to have to redesign or relocate most of the world's major cities. That's a really exciting design challenge, or it should be. No, I mean, it's going to be horrible, right? I mean, there's going to be a lot of suffering, associated with moving some of these cities. But the more proactively we engage that opportunity, the more, architects put themselves out in front. I mean, I think the better the outcomes for everybody else. So I think that it's central to my optimism that, behind every crisis is an ability to build something better than what existed before. And I'm looking at the future that way.
Can you speak more about what the vulnerability is? So, I mean, you talked about our inability to communicate our value, right? But it's bigger than that for me. What are your views on the different vulnerabilities in the profession?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could look at the whole value question as part of a meta crisis within the profession of architecture. And I think there are certainly, issues of culture that play into that, create that, and then result from that at the same time. And, a lot of things associated with, I don't know, architecture school or the history of architecture. I mean, I think that if I'm being asked to break down, this kind of crisis of value, I would point to several things. One is the insularity of the profession. I mean, I think that's one of the meta drivers. The fact that we, lock our students in studio at 19 years old, and we fetishize the idea of living in studio. And, we graduate people who, well, I don't want to make generalizations, but I think it draws a wall around architecture as this sort of like tribe that, no one outside can understand and no one outside is worth listening to. And I'll say that, I think most architects kind of get their head right, by their mid-20s or something like that. But that's still a strong vein in our profession. It's this idea that what's important about what's happening in architecture can be found inside of architecture, and what's going on outside of architecture is probably immaterial. And I think that's one of the big problems of the AI crisis as well, is that, architects are talking a lot about what AI is going to do within architecture, or what kind of architecture they can make with AI, but they're not talking about what everybody else is going to do with AI and what people are potentially going to do to architecture with AI, which I think is the larger question. So, I mean, I think the insularity issue would be a big one. I think the exclusivity of it. I mean, U.S. universities are pretty exclusive to begin with. But then you talk about, the time demands and, the very particular rigors of architecture school versus, any other kind of program. And I think it screens out a lot of people that we could really use. I don't know if you knew anybody in school who was trying to get through architecture school while having a family. I mean, it's damn near impossible if you've got, kids, or even if you have a spouse. Like, it's hard because of the way architecture school is organized and this sort of thing. And I think, those sorts of, what would you call it, proto-crises, maybe they're a driver of the value thing, maybe they're a component of it. But, I would say that when you get those factors, the kind of lack of diversification, the insularity, on a desert island, after a while, everything starts to seem normal, right? So I think we fail to adapt very rapidly because we keep our own counsel on a lot of ideas. And, there's not enough people at the window, like knocking on the window, being like, hey, that doesn't make any sense and you should stop doing that. Or when they do, we don't trust them because they're not in the tribe. So, yeah, I mean, I think all of these kind of roll together to kind of create that vulnerability. And you see its effects, right? So, I mean, in 2008, 2009, the effect was massive unemployment because, we nurture this insularity that prevents us from answering that value question. Because ultimately, what I want to answer as an architect is, how much value is my personal architecture to the field? How am I being esteemed within this tribe of architecture, rather than asking, like, how is architecture esteemed in the world? And like, how is architecture, the idea, like the general practice, esteemed by people who are outside the tribe? And yeah, the result is wide scale unemployment. And I think we're witnessing something similar now, where everybody is talking about massive wide scale disruption associated with AI. And, the IMF and the World Bank are, predicting tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of jobs affected. And, still to a large degree, I talk to architects and their thinking is, well, that's not us, like it can't possibly affect what we do because this is architecture. And I think that's that kind of tribal thinking that got us in trouble the last time.
Yes. So you mentioned that our focus should be on what others can do with AI to affect architecture. And I think when architects think about AIs and other people affecting the work that we do, we're protected, we have our license, to get buildings built that are larger than 2,000 square feet and not residential. Like, there is some gatekeeping that we still hold within the industry. So what is the disruptive potential of what others can do with AI when it comes to architecture? Or where do you see that beginning to bubble up and already happen?
I mean, I think that requires some imagination. And, one of the curious parts about being a disaster architect, when you practice as an architect, to some degree, your role is to help people imagine the best possible outcome, right? I mean, that's why they call it highest and best use, right? So you got an empty lot, you want to do a building, like what is the best possible version of this ambition? And part of being a disaster architect, it includes that too, but it's also helping people imagine the worst possible thing that could happen, and imagining the collapse of the gatekeeping and the safeguards and that sort of thing. So it's kind of an act of morbid imagination, but here's something that occupies my imagination. A large real estate developer that spends $100 million a year on architecture fees across the country decides that it's really the better business decision to invest $10 million in R&D and build, essentially an AI automated design shop. I don't think we have the technology now, and probably won't for a while, to have something that is exclusively automated. But we have a lot of tools that can automate away a lot of what an architect does. So they set up their own in-house shop and they hire, a handful of architects because they need someone with a stamp, right? And they need someone to hang the liability on. But, basically they just fire all the architects that they've employed for the last 100 years. And they say, you know what, we can do this. And all that designy stuff you guys are always talking about, like, turns out we don't care. So we're just going to, have our, AI driven in-house design shop and a few architects to stamp drawings and things like that. And, there goes a huge chunk of the profession. Now, that doesn't violate any of existing laws regarding licensure or stamping or anything like that. That's just, economics playing itself out. That seems plausible to me. And I think if I were a large real estate developer, I'd at least be looking at that as a possibility. So, I mean, I think those are the sort of things that I'm concerned about and that I worry about.
Yeah, I'm just trying to ground the bigger thinking in actual potential case studies about why we should have a voice in this. I mean, my biggest concern with architects and how we tend to react to the world around us, short of saying that's not going to affect us, is then in doing that, we don't have enough curiosity to say, if it does affect us, what voice do we want to have in that change, and how do we guide it to a more opportunistic outcome for us? by having a voice in the creation of those technologies. Like I feel like architects think about AI right now and they're like, no, it's not there. But we should be saying it could get there. So how are we a part of actually helping it get there so that our voice is included from the beginning?
I think that's very legitimate. I mean, I think licensure is a double-edged sword, right? Because it protects the market, but at the same time, it convinces you that the market is permanent, right? And can't be affected. And I think that's incorrect. And I strongly agree that we should be outside the wall and, curious about what's happening, investigating what's happening, and trying to steer it. To your previous question about what is a tactical example of this. I spoke with an architect a couple of months ago who told me the story of one of their clients doing SDs on Midjourney, right? And they had some initial meeting, and it was like, look, it'll cost this much to go through a schematic design process and try and manifest some of these ideas. And the client was like, look, let me just play around with Midjourney, and I'll come up with some ideas, and I'll bring them to you, and we can go into design development. Now, we as architects know that Midjourney isn't designing buildings, right? It's just designing images. But because people don't know that, they're willing to go through this alternate process where they're using Midjourney or DALL-E to manifest their ideas, which are then brought to the architect. And that gets back to the value question, right? I mean, if you knew the real value of an architect, you would never do that. But if you don't, then, Midjourney seems just the more valuable proposition, right? Because Midjourney costs what, $20 a month or something. And this way I don't have to pay my architect. So, I mean, I feel like we're kind of going down the road that doctors went down 20 years ago when Google broke loose, right? And all the doctors I know hate Google because they got to spend the first 10 minutes of every appointment.
WebMD, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, okay, thank you for checking with Dr. Google. As it turns out, I'm a trained physician. Let's go through an exam. Let's figure out what's actually wrong with you. You probably don't have Ebola. But that's a value problem too, right? I mean, if people think that, Googling something is actually the same thing as going to medical school for 9 years, it's going to cause a lot of headaches for doctors. And I think, the same is here true with architecture now. I mean, as these tools take shape and they become more robust, it's easier and easier for those kinds of people to believe that there's an equivalency there between, typing some instructions in a program and getting some results and, the actual experience and wisdom of an actual architect.
Yeah. You and I also talked about just data. I feel like people say, we have all this data that we can do stuff with, especially if we're in Rivet, especially if we're doing in BIM. We have data for buildings. We're ahead. That's something that we can do generative AI with. And I think both of us kind of, and you definitely had me questioning, but what is the potential of that data? I guess my question is, how do we get more architects engaged in the conversation in an educational way? I struggle because architects really don't want to learn about these things because it's really about the economics of practice, and it's about thinking beyond the design of our buildings. And inherently, like you said, designers especially, they don't want to think beyond buildings. So what can we do to get architects more excited about this?
I don't think we have to do anything. I mean, I think that inertia is going to carry us into another unemployment crisis, and then people will start to get real curious about it. No, I mean, I hate to be morbid, but I think that is the truth, and it's a strangely optimistic truth that comes from my experiences in disaster. People don't necessarily want to start paying attention to the levee that's got cracks in it until it breaks, and it's at that moment that you capitalize on the attention that the levee now has, right? So the levee breaks, that's tragic, but then we say, okay, how about we go around and fix all the levees? And in that moment in time, there is, the will, the energy, the curiosity to say, yeah, like maybe we should do that. So one of the things that I teach my students a lot is, have solutions on the shelf, right? Have an answer for, what we should do. And then, be realistic. Like, you're not necessarily going to like move the ocean liner before there's some sort of crisis that instigates people's attention. So, that's what I've been trying to do in my work is to have solutions on the shelf. And I think what's going to happen shortly is that, some people are going to start losing their jobs. Hopefully it's not too bad. And then some of those people are going to say, hey, you know what? All these new technologies around, what if I just thought of this thing de novo, right? And what if I went out and started my own firm, but like an AI first firm? Like, what can an architect be now that all these technologies are available and at our disposal? I'm not sure if you and I talked about it, but to me, like universal translation is one of like the biggest ones. I mean, that's crazy to think about that we can now basically talk with anyone on earth in their own language. I mean, that in itself creates, an enormous amount of opportunities. So, what could we do to steer the conversation? I think the same thing that we're doing and the same thing you do every week on Practice Disrupted, have the conversations, like be the thought leaders, like have the information out there, issue the warnings and stuff like that. But, be realistic about the fact that the big push, happens in moments of crisis. So, yeah, I think that we have to look at whatever's going to happen with AI as an opportunity to really push on some of those reforms that, let's be honest, like we all know the same things about architecture, right? I mean, the hours are too long, the pay is too low, the path to licensure is too long. You get 10 architects in a room, they're all going to bitch about the same like five things. But inertia is a bitch, and those things are hard to fix. So yeah, I guess I'm hoping that we can do a lot of this work amid the crises of AI and climate change and everything that's unfolding.
Yeah. I guess my question, well, yes, and I hope we do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah, that's the dream. I mean, if everybody would just start listening to us, Evelyn, then, we could get all this fixed before the disaster happens. I'm not going to stop talking. I think that this is a really serious crisis. And, the more that we take something seriously beforehand and design against it, the lower the eventual impact is. And in fact, like, we don't have a lot of disasters that we used to have specifically because of architects, right? Because like of the built environment and the way that we have learned how to design that. And that goes back many centuries, past the Enlightenment at least. We found ways to design buildings and design cities that, essentially obviate disaster and prevent disasters from ever happening in the first place. So, yes, if we can gather the will to address some of these questions in architecture, we won't have to go through another 2008. So, yes, maybe if I'm going to be a real optimist, that's the way I should look at it. So thank you for calling me out on that.
I hope that we get there sooner than later. I feel like our voice in the conversation needs to be added sooner rather than later. And instead of being reactive, I lean more towards being proactive in order to control what I can control. So we have a lot of young listeners who are like, okay, so Eric's telling me I need to get those ideas and put them on the shelf and be ready for when I need to pull them off the shelf. Any other advice for those that are out there, short of, rather than being a design first firm, thinking about what an AI first firm looks like, that you can kind of add on to this conversation as a way for them to be proactive? And is there any other opportunities, or, how do we begin to ask those questions, to go back to what you said way back about disasters and showing up and being asked to come to the table? What advice do you have for the next generation of leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the future is so unpredictable at this point. Well, I mean, I guess the future is always unpredictable, but, things are changing so rapidly at this point that what you fundamentally have control over is yourself, probably. And I think that makes more true some advice that I've always given to young designers, which is design yourself, like design the world that you want to inhabit. I think a lot of young designers make the mistake of thinking that their design energy, call it that, needs to be focused on a building, that their creativity needs to be restricted to the four corners of a drafting board. I mean, metaphorically at this point, you can use all of that on everything else too. You can be a designer of the world. You can be a designer of your community, and you must be a designer of yourself. You can turn that creative energy and all those, processes and tactics and judgments that they teach you in architecture school, like those work on other things too. Like they don't have to be like on a building. So not that you shouldn't design buildings. If you love designing buildings, you should do that. But don't feel agency less in your own life because you do have this superpower called design. And, when you turn that towards, other things, the results can be actually pretty remarkable. I wish I had done a better job of designing my life. I think a lot of it kind of came together by happenstance. But that too, I think, points to the second lesson that I would share is just, work from values. Your job's going to change. Your city's going to change. Like everything's going to change. So you need some sort of anchor point. And I think the best one is, whatever your values are. I think that, a lot of times we talk about architecture in a way that's value agnostic, right? I mean, it's always struck me as kind of weird that we have this sub-discipline of social impact design where I've spent most of my career. I mean, all design is social impact, right? I mean, it's just like weird that we would like give a separate label to that. So I think, when you start off from, whatever your core values are and you say, I'm going to act out of these and I'm going to do what's necessary to fulfill these things, that's going to lead to a fuller design life, I think.
I mean, I think, it's interesting because there is a book out there called Design Your Life, written by two Stanford individuals that I always refer people to when they, no matter where they are in their career, when they're kind of thinking about what's next and their transferable skills. And I think this inherent worry that as architects, we've carved ourselves into a singular solution for our careers. So I think it's helpful. Hi, Disruptors. Thank you for joining us today on an episode of Practice Disrupted. If you like the content for today's show, you can find all of our past episodes over on practiceofarchitecture.com/podcast. Be a part of the conversation by joining me, our speakers, and other disruptors in our community at practiceofarchitecture.com/community. Our social media handle is Practice of Arch. That's Practice of ARCH. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to drop us a DM and say hello. Tune in next week for a new conversation on change in the profession.